Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I've been in a wheelchair since I was 52, after a bad slip and fall accident at my old job where I messed up 2 discs in my spine. When the company couldn't keep me on light duty, I ended up on disability and forced to find a cheaper place to live. That's how I first crossed paths with Ms. Grover, though you might as well call her Ms. Karen. She owned a handful of rental properties in my town, a sleepy little suburb with a quiet reputation, and her online listings were the only ones I could afford. The place looked charming in the pictures, a spacious ground floor apartment, ramps installed at both the front and back entrances, plus a designated handicapped parking spot right out front. Honestly, it seemed like a dream come true. The day I moved in was the first time I actually got to meet Ms. Grover face to face. She was standing in the driveway, wearing a bright pink cardigan with a rhinestone brooch, tapping her foot while I rolled out of the car. She had that "you on my turf" look, a sharp stare and pursed lips, arms folded. But she greeted me with a cool, clipped, "Welcome, Linda. I expect you'll keep this place neat." That was it. No "how are you?" or "do you need help?" Just a reminder, I guess, that she was in control. Initially, I didn't worry too much. I've seen people like her before, folks who like things done their way. But then little things started adding up. First, the ramp in the back was too steep for me to use safely. My wheelchair almost tipped backward the first time I tried. When I mentioned it, Ms. Grover responded that it was up to code, which I seriously doubted, and maybe I should get a stronger arm if I couldn't maneuver up the incline. Another time, she left a sticky note on my door about wheelchair tracks marking the hardwood floors. I'd only been there a week, but she demanded I pay an extra deposit for damage. I remember staring at the note, wondering how on earth she thought those scuffs were my fault. The floors were old, and I was so careful, I even put small pads on my wheels to avoid scratching anything. But Ms. Grover insisted. She cornered me in the hallway the next morning as I was heading out to a doctor's appointment and said, "Linda, you'll need to pony up for that damage deposit. I don't have the time or inclination to keep reminding you of your responsibilities." It was humiliating. Her voice echoed, making sure all the neighbors could hear that I was, apparently, a delinquent tenant. I tried explaining about the protective pads, showing her pictures and receipts. She just rolled her eyes, claiming I probably installed them incorrectly. "Some people are just naturally destructive," she snapped, adjusting her brooch like she was trying to emphasize her moral superiority. It didn't stop there. Within a couple of weeks, Ms. Grover began showing up unannounced. She'd barge in with a ring of keys dangling in her hand, claiming she had to inspect the place, or that she was just making sure everything is all right. I'm pretty sure the law says a landlord has to give at least 24 hours notice, but she didn't seem to care. More than once, I'd be startled awake from a nap on my recliner, hearing the door unlock and Ms. Grover's voice calling out, "Linda? Linda, you in here?" The real trouble started the day she tried to let herself into my bathroom. I was taking a shower, and out of nowhere, I heard banging on the door. Before I could respond, Ms. Grover was shrieking, "I'm coming in." I desperately reached for my robe. Luckily, I had the presence of mind to lock the bathroom door, or she'd have barged in, no question. When I confronted her, after I'd managed to get out, half-soaked and furious, she insisted there was a leak in the pipes and she had to check immediately. I hadn't heard a single drip, but to her, that was apparently not my place to question. I realized then that Ms. Grover's controlling behavior wasn't just quirky or a bit overbearing, it was invasive. I started dreading every creak and thump in the hallway, half expecting her to show up at any moment with some new complaint. Each time, she'd find a new excuse. "I smell something burning, I need to test the smoke alarm, I thought I heard animals." And it wasn't just me. My neighbor from upstairs, Marjorie, confided that Ms. Grover had some bizarre vendetta against people who didn't take care of her building. But Marjorie's stories paled in comparison to what I'd experienced. I tried reasoning with Ms. Grover, telling her I was more than willing to follow any rules listed in my lease. I even offered to have my nephew from out of town come by and patch any actual damage at my own expense. But Ms. Grover wasn't interested. She said, "People don't respect property these days. I have to stay on top of them so they don't ruin what's mine." And it was the way she said it, "What's mine?" as if I had no rights or privacy. I soon realized that the next few months would be an uphill battle. Little did I know, it was only the beginning, and that we'd both end up confronting the law before this was over. By the time early winter rolled around, the situation was getting worse. Ms. Grover had decided that my wheelchair itself was a fire hazard. According to her, the corridor leading to my apartment was dangerously cramped due to the presence of my wheels. Now, mind you, the corridor was plenty wide, with enough space for two people to pass comfortably. My neighbor's teenage grandson used to wheel me out sometimes, and there were no issues. But Ms. Grover insisted. She stuck bright red warning notes on my front door, referencing random county codes. She claimed that if the fire department found out, I'd be in violation of some safety regulation that might get her building shut down. Feeling cornered, I reached out to the local fire station for clarification. They were kind enough to send over a lieutenant who did a quick check. He assured me that my hallway was not obstructed. The official wrote a short note for Ms. Grover, stating there were no apparent violations. That might have been the end of it, but Ms. Grover wasn't having it. She tore the note out of my hand, read it with a twisted look on her face, and spat, "We'll see about that." I tried to keep my cool, but inside I was shaking. Dealing with her aggression took a toll on me mentally, and my doctor started noticing changes in my blood pressure. He kept reminding me to minimize stress, but how was I supposed to stay calm when Ms. Grover hovered over me like a hawk? I decided to document everything. I started writing down dates and times she entered without permission. I took photos of every note she stuck on my door. I figured if I ever needed legal protection, at least I'd have proof. A couple of weeks before Christmas, Ms. Grover's behavior escalated dramatically. One day, a police car pulled up outside. I was watching TV when an officer knocked. He looked uncomfortable, as if he was already regretting this visit. According to him, Ms. Grover had called in a noise complaint. Apparently, loud screeching was coming from my apartment. The officer politely asked if I'd been blasting music or hosting a party. I couldn't help but laugh because I was alone, crocheting a scarf for my granddaughter while listening to some gentle holiday tunes. Hardly a ruckus. The officer took a quick look around, nodded, and said, "Apologies. Clearly, there's no violation here." Then he left. I thought that was just a one-off. But 2 nights later, at around 9 p.m., I heard more banging at the door. This time, it was Ms. Grover herself, ranting about illegal modifications to the unit. I'd installed a small grab bar in the shower with the help of my nephew. I had actually gotten Ms. Grover's verbal permission over the phone months ago. She insisted she had no recollection of that conversation. Now she threatened to call the police again unless I removed the bar immediately. I tried to explain it was a safety measure, something I literally needed to prevent me from falling. She wasn't hearing it. "If you can't manage without drilling holes in my walls, maybe you need to move to a nursing home," she sneered. I was trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. I told her I wasn't removing the grab bar and that she needed to consult the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines, or at least show me where in the lease it prohibited such a modification. That set her off. She started yelling that this building has historical status, and you're destroying it. Then she whipped out her phone as if to record me. I just shut the door. I had never felt so invaded in my life. The next morning, I found an eviction notice taped to my door. It stated that I had broken the terms of the lease by causing structural damage and disturbing the peace. My heart was pounding, and my head was spinning. None of it was true, but I felt powerless. Sure, I had documentation, but the thought of going to court terrified me. I'm on a fixed income, and I can't afford fancy lawyers. Not to mention the emotional toll that dragging this out would take on me. I called my nephew, Mark, who's a paralegal in a neighboring state, and he told me I needed to fight it. He reminded me that Ms. Grover had to follow proper legal procedures and that I had the right to an attorney. There were even non-profit organizations that offered free legal help to tenants with disabilities. Fueled by a mix of anger and resolve, I decided I was done being pushed around. Ms. Grover could call the police 100 times, but I knew deep down I was in the right. My nephew helped me find a local housing advocate who specialized in cases involving ADA compliance. We began preparing for what looked like an inevitable court battle. Meanwhile, Ms. Grover was still rummaging around the building, sticking notes on my door every other day. But there was a shift in my attitude. I stopped letting her intimidate me. In fact, each time I saw her scribbling on another one of those neon pink post-it notes, I'd smirk, because every piece of evidence she left might just come back to haunt her. By January, Ms. Grover's threat of eviction was more than just talk. She filed an official notice with the local court, claiming I'd violated multiple lease conditions and had created unsafe living conditions. Fortunately, with my nephew's guidance and the help of the housing advocate, I was able to respond properly. We gathered a mountain of proof: the letter from the fire department, medical documentation of my disability needs, photos of the so-called damage, which amounted to a few scuffs on the already worn floor, and timestamps of Ms. Grover's countless unannounced visits. The day of the hearing arrived, and I felt physically sick wheeling into that small courthouse. Ms. Grover was there, dressed in a conservative blazer, looking smug as ever. She had a high-priced attorney with her, someone who obviously thought this would be an easy victory. I was nervous beyond words. But once we got inside that courtroom, my nerves gave way to a fierce determination to be heard. Ms. Grover's attorney started by painting me as a difficult tenant who refused to follow rules. She claimed I installed hazardous equipment in the shower and left mobility devices in communal areas, blocking emergency exits. She even brought up that I'd attracted the police, twisting the facts around so that it sounded like I was hosting wild parties. I felt my face heat up as the judge glanced at me. But then my attorney, a volunteer from a local tenant rights group, asked Ms. Grover point-blank about her repeated unannounced visits. Ms. Grover squirmed, insisting she was always invited in, or that she had smelled gas or heard a leak. My attorney then showed pictures of all those neon pink notes she left on my door, some with timestamps right after midnight, or at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. The judge's eyebrows shot up. Then came the fire department note. The judge read it carefully. It clearly stated that my wheelchair in the hallway posed no obstruction hazard. That directly contradicted Ms. Grover's claims of me creating safety issues. Ms. Grover's attorney tried to switch tactics, suddenly focusing on the historic nature of the building. But the judge quickly cut him off, noting that Ms. Grover, as a landlord, was expected to abide by ADA requirements if she was renting to disabled tenants. My eyes started to tear up, not out of sadness, but relief. Finally, someone in authority was taking my side, acknowledging that Ms. Grover's so-called reasons for eviction were baseless. The whole process took nearly 2 hours. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly explained how the grab bar in the shower was essential for my safety, that Ms. Grover had given me verbal permission before changing her tune, and that I'd offered to pay for any repairs or modifications. I also described how she'd threatened me, telling me I belonged in a nursing home if I couldn't handle an old building. The judge listened intently, glancing at Ms. Grover occasionally, who was fidgeting with her blazer button. Finally, the judge ruled in my favor. The eviction was dismissed. Moreover, the judge chastised Ms. Grover for what appeared to be blatant discrimination based on my disability, as well as multiple violations of tenant privacy laws. She warned Ms. Grover that if she continued this pattern, she could face serious legal repercussions. Ms. Grover looked furious, her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. I could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. After the hearing, as I was exiting the courthouse, Ms. Grover caught up with me. I braced for another confrontation, but surprisingly, she spoke in a low voice, trying to sound calm. "I'm sorry things got so out of hand. Let's try to start fresh." It felt hollow, like she was only apologizing because the judge had threatened her with penalties. I just nodded. I didn't have the energy to lash out or accept her words in that moment. The emotional drain was too heavy. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a difference. No more random knocks at the door. No more neon pink post-it notes. She stayed away. I still felt uneasy, double-checking the locks now and then, worried she might come by with some new trick up her sleeve. But she kept her distance, probably because the judge's warning was still ringing in her ears. I eventually reached a point where I could sleep soundly again. My nephew helped me contact a local group that advocates for better disability accommodations. They even offered to mediate discussions if Ms. Grover had any legitimate property concerns in the future. But she never did ask for a meeting. Months passed without a peep. Word around town was that Ms. Grover tried to raise the rent on another tenant, who threatened legal action too. She seems to have quieted down since then. People sometimes ask me if I ever considered moving out. Of course I have. But here's the thing, affordable, wheelchair-accessible apartments aren't exactly abundant. I couldn't just up and leave unless I wanted to spend double or triple elsewhere. Ms. Grover knows that, and for a long time, I think she used it as leverage to intimidate me. But thanks to the law and a little help from family, I learned how to stand my ground. I'm sharing this story because, for a lot of us on a fixed income, especially those dealing with health or mobility issues, fighting a landlord in court can feel impossible. But trust me, you can fight back. Document everything, seek legal aid, someone will listen. And if there's a Karen out there who thinks they can bully you out of your basic rights and dignity, sometimes the best answer is to stand up and say no because, as it turns out, we have more power than they think.